Good evening, everyone. The time is now 7 p.m., which does mean it is time to get this evening's webinar off to a start. So I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's subject is, of course, the deHavilland Mosquito and its impressive accomplishments, primarily in the Second World War. We're fortunate here at the Military Aviation Museum to have one of the few flying examples of the type in the world. And I think we've all had an opportunity from the response to this evening's webinar to just see how exciting and engaging a subject the mosquito really is, and how deep an emotional connection people feel to the type. Um, there are those of you who are probably aware that we had a minor snafu on our Facebook page. We posted an image of a hornet instead of a mosquito, and were very quickly corrected by lots and lots of people who were kind of like, hey, that's not a mosquito. And I think that in and of itself is in some way a reflection of the special connection people feel to this unique and incredible aircraft type. So that's probably about enough from me. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ross Sharp. Ross is the Director of Engineering and Airframe Compliance with the People's Mosquito. Ross is going to tell us a little bit more about that project, but it's basically aimed at resurrecting one of these iconic aircraft over in the United Kingdom. So Ross, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you for all the great work you guys are doing, not just on the airplane, but in cataloging the history of these incredible aircraft. Ross, are you there with us?
Most certainly, and thank you so much for a lovely introduction, Keegan.
Well, it's all yours. Take it away, and I'll be back at the end with some questions for you, no doubt.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the first slide is a bit of a horror show, so to speak. That, fortunately for those that we have my webcam muted, is me. And a bit of a trivia question later, which Keegan can post if you get the right answer. What is the Royal Air Force fighter trainer that I'm in? So I had an enviable job, to put it mildly. I was Deputy Air Show Coordinator for the Royal Air Force at Royal Air Force Finningley and Royal Air Force Waddington, putting together the largest of the RAF's official shows. But tonight's presentation is all about the Mosquito, and we classify this over here as the first multi-role combat aircraft. And that's a classic shot of a Mosquito. That's a late war B-16, a pressurized high-altitude bomber version, typical of those used by the light night striking force of Bomber Command to literally flatten German targets in the years 1943, 44, 45. The Mosquito family. Major families of the Mosquito include fighters, night fighters, bombers, photo reconnaissance aircraft, fighter bombers, plus trainers, target tugs, intruders, naval strike aircraft, civilian unarmed courier aircraft, and we'll see more of that, resource mapping aircraft, dedicated clear air turbulence research aircraft, jet research aircraft, weather ELINT aircraft, air racers, etc. That's not a bad record. Building the Mozzie. That is a lovely photograph, circa 1943, of one of the main areas of the deHavilland Hatfield factory. You can see, of course, as all of you doubtless know, that the Mosquito had a one-piece wing constructed with scarfed joints along spruce spars. And there are two families of Mosquito represented in this photograph. The camouflage wings belong to those bombers, and the all blue wing belongs to the PR types. The reason that the Mosquito was allowed to be built was the argument made by Sir Geoffrey and others that the Mosquito would take up only 650 pounds weight of light alloy castings and forgings, and make little demand on the skilled metalworking workforce needed to build such things as Spitfires and Lancasters. As you can see, a large, highly skilled workforce of furniture makers, cabinet makers, and other woodworking trades were roped in, and a very much dispersed production system was evolved. Here we see Stiles and Mealing Limited producing fuselages. That particular one is for either a PR or a bomber version, as you see by the V cutout at the front there, the fuselage. And there's, I said, a very, very diverse workforce. And that's the same fuselage with the driver posed outside his house. Here we have another shot of production, but this is in Canada. Mosquitoes were built in 6 factories in the UK, both during World War II and some of them post-war, and also in one facility in Canada and one in Australia. The wing leading edge you can see there will also carry a tray underneath, which will hold the oil cooler, the cabin heater, and the engine radiator in a special tray. Here we can see that a lovely shot of, it's posed I know, but it's still very, very nice, at Hatfield, taken in 1943. And you can see the way that the Mosquito is constructed with bulkheads, 7 of them. You can see 1, 2, 3 of them there. And the hydraulics run down one side, the starboard side, and the control cables and most of the electrics run down the port side. This allows both systems to be worked at simultaneously and a much faster build. By the way, a fuselage could take a highly skilled crew of 7 people, approximately 8 to 9 days, depending on various conditions. I've actually got one of these things on my desk as we speak. For those of you who are unsure what that is, it's a disc of just about 1.5 millimeter 3-ply plywood with a nice round Bakelite boss, and inside that boss is a brass threaded component, and this is a ferrule, and there are thousands of these in any Mosquito of varying types. What you do, you actually drill through the inner plywood core into the plywood, insert the Bakelite plug, it's glued in place, and when secured you can then attach with obviously a threaded screw a component such as a radio, throttle controls, etc. As I said, furniture makers played a large part in the production of the Mosquito. They also played a large part in its technical evolution. EGOM Limited, and that's the management of the company there, not only produced Mosquito parts, they also solved the problem that deHavilland had with the original glue formulation for the Mosquito, which used casein. Now, casein is made from an orthophosphoroprotein found in milk. You add slate lime, calcium hydroxide, water, stirred it. You made a rough equivalent of Elmer's in effect. And it was a very good glue, but it was found to be biodegradable and unstable in the tropics. And GOMS introduced deHavilland's to the 2-pack epoxy resin called Aerolite 303, which they were using to make their plywood furniture, examples of which you can see here. And it worked wonders. Workforce, I said, was diverse. Again, you've got one of these on Kilo Alpha 114. It's a dinghy box, and it's located immediately behind the cockpit framing on the spine of the aircraft. And it was designed to eject a 2-man dinghy on contact with water if the aircraft landed. As I said, there were 6 sites that built the Mosquito in the United Kingdom. This is some of the staff and workforce of the Standard Motor Company Limited. The gentleman who has got a broad grin standing immediately below the fuselage access door is the test pilot for Standard. I'm told that having flown over 1,000 of these FB6 aircraft, and that's the only mark that Standard made, he never flew another aircraft again. They're very good, by the way. Most of the Standard produced aircraft went out to the Far East or to Coastal Command. That is a shot in Canada. I know this because you can see this placard here. It says GM 844. That stands for General Motors Canada. who produced fuselages for the Mosquito production line. As you will know, the pickup structure for the wing is generally made out of walnut. It's an extremely durable wood. And there you can see the tray I spoke about earlier with the cabin heat exchanger and the radiator and the oil cooler. Absolutely. The photograph you can see here is that of Joan Fontaine. She and her sister, the late Olivia de Havilland, were cousins of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland Sr. And Joan was heavily involved in promoting the Mosquito, and here you can see her at the rollout of the first Canadian B Mark 7, a bomber prototype that wasn't produced in quantity. This is another Canadian bomber, it's the B-20, and you can see it's a fairly rare color wartime shot. It shows the lovely, elegant lines of the Mozzie. And this is a promotional poster, wartime one, by de Havilland, promoting the fact that Canadian Mosquitoes were flying across the Atlantic to join the fight, though it didn't actually mention Canada. It says, now also built in the New World, British-designed Mosquitoes fly to the attack. I should explain that every single Mosquito that's flown across from Gander to Prestwick in Scotland, and they regularly broke the west-east air speed record across the Atlantic. First steps. This is the prototype. This is E0234, the company designation for the prototype. It took a great battle for Geoffrey de Havilland to get the Mosquito accepted. The Air Ministry did not like the idea of a bomber without gun turrets and without extra crew, but de Havilland recognized if you shaved away all the excess weight and structure that gun turrets, ammunition and other things meant, then you could get an aircraft that was going to be faster than contemporary Spitfires. Fortunately, Air Vice Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman made an order, an experimental order for one Mosquito. He was allowed to do that because he was the air member for research, which was later expanded to 50 aircraft. It's going to be a mix of photo reconnaissance and a few bombers. But things really rolled from then. This is the first flight, 15th of November, 1940. And the aircraft had been designed at Salisbury Hall, which is a medieval mansion outside of London, and it was the home of Nell Gwyn, the paramour of King Charles, but we won't go into that. However, the whole team formed what might be termed a small skunk works, and the Mosquito was designed in great secrecy and the prototype built in such. Fortunately for us, it still exists to this day. And as I was saying to Keegan earlier, this Mosquito W4050 at the Mosquito de Havilland Aircraft Museum is the only World War II type built in quantity whose prototype exists to this day. You can't say that about the B-17, the Spitfire, the Hurricane Me-109. No, this is the only real World War II prototype, a highly significant aircraft. And this, as I explained, is a gratuitous solar topi shot. This is a Mosquito F2 that was sent out to India along with a small batch for tropical trials. It looks rather well worn, as you can see, but certainly the Mosquito did play its part out in the Southeast Asia Command area. Early operations. Here you can see W4072, which was a PR1 conversion of the basic bomber type. These were handed over to number 1 Photo Reconnaissance Unit at Royal Air Force Benson, and they performed sterling work despite the fact that they had some problems. Two things to note, please. You can see that the engine nacelle does not extend to the trailing edge of the wing. That caused some problems during handling trials with buffeting around about the 300 miles an hour mark. And de Havilland solved this by extending, not once but twice, the length of the original end of the nacelle, which is in aluminium alloy, just a V shape, a cone shape, I should say. And you can actually, or when I examined that on the prototype, when it was assembled, you can actually see that they fitted the lengthier nacelle end over the original one, and that still exists on the prototype, though you can't see it. The problem was that by doing that, deHavilland had a full flap area beyond that, and that meant that the Mosquito had to be slightly redesigned and split flaps either side of the nacelle installed. You can also see something which is quite amazing to those who know Merlins, a single exhaust port and the heavy staining. They had a collector system, and this was found to inhibit performance, of course, and led to massive overheating. And of course, it then went to a two exhaust port arrangement. And then eventually, of course, the 5 ports you will get with the Siamese ports on exhaust 5 and 6, as on Kilo Alpha 114. And then on the 2-stage Merlin, 6 ports. It's a classic shot by the photographer Charlie Brown of the B4, B Mark IV, the first bomber version, and it's that's on a delivery flight. No squadron codes, as you can see, just this aircraft serial, and the heavy staining from the exhaust. That is a shot of the first Royal Air Force station that had mosquitoes, armed mosquitoes, with number 105 Squadron and number 139 at Royal Air Force Marham. And these performed sterling work with Royal Air Force Bomber Command with 2 group before they were handed onto the main force, where they performed night marking and other night interdiction type work. They switched over from daytime sorties. That's another Marham shot, as you can see the camouflage hangars in the background, and the rather insubstantial foldable entry ladder. I don't think I'm going to risk that. We do have the plans actually for the much more robust ground crew access ladder, which you can wheel around. It's a lovely wartime shot. This, as I explained to Veronica, is a gratuitous Scotty dog shot matched with a Mosquito. An early B Mark IV, as you can see, these are 500-pounders, and though they don't have the collapsible fin of the Trials 500-pound bombs, and later the short fin version and the tail fuse, which deHavilland designed themselves. This is quite a rare shot. This is the commanding officer of number 23 Squadron and one of his Mosquito NF2 intruder versions. These were specially modified versions of the NF2. They had the radar removed and extra tankage fitted, so they could perform what you might call moonlight intruder sorties. And they were the first aircraft to be deployed overseas in quantity. The squadron flew out to Malta via Gibraltar and Algeria, and played havoc with Rommel's motor transport in over Tunisia, and then over Sicily, supporting the invasion of that island and the mainland of Italy. Never let it be said that we don't mention the contribution of the ladies of the Mosquito. They didn't just build them, they flew them. These are 2 members of the Air Transport Auxiliary and their NF2. Notice the bow-shaped radar aerial that was omitted from the last shot. 4 303 Brownings, of course, and 4 20mm Hispano cannon. One of the joys of the deHavilland design was that right from day one, Sir Geoffrey insisted that room be made under the fuselage floor for 4 20mm cannon, and thank goodness he did so. The ATA took Mosquitoes from the factories to the squadrons or maintenance units or operational training units as required, and shuttled them about between them. Various places, and a marvelous job they did too. They were headquartered at White Waltham Airfield, just out to the west of London. This is what happens if you get too close to a deHavilland 217 and let go with that armament. This is an F2, and as you can see, almost all the fabric has been stripped off the aircraft. You can see also that the port propeller has been feathered, and it returned from sortie over Holland on one engine. This wasn't uncommon with the Mosquitoes. They had a very respectable single engine performance. The aircraft is covered in fabric, usually 80 grams per square meter Medapalum cotton. They can be reinforced with linen in certain areas, for the simple reason that that's how you get the aerodynamic performance. It's not just the fact that there's a roughly 90-degree angle between the fuselage and the main plane, or the fact that the wing is set well far forward, which will reduce viscous drag of the whole airframe, or the fact that it has a smaller wetted area than most twins, that is the smaller total skin that's going to be affected by airflow. No, it's the fact that once you made the butt joints with the birch spruce ply in the nose, you then covered that with doped down Medapalum cotton, and then put filler coat over the top and smoothed it down, and then sprayed the camouflage coats on top of that. It made for an extremely slippery airframe. As you can see, though, they were durable. Multi-role combat aircraft, indeed, more and more roles. This is the Mozzie in its natural habitat, at least its natural habitat in Banff, Scotland, in the winter of 1944-45. There you can see Mosquitoes taxiing out for another strike on German shipping or coastal targets all along the Norwegian or Danish coast, and indeed, in the later stage of the war, into the Baltic itself. The Banff Strike Wing of Coastal Command was led by this gentleman here, at that time Sir Max Aitken. He was the son of Lord Beaverbrook, who was at one time the Minister of Aircraft Production, and he was a genuine Battle of Britain fighter ace. And the powers that be tried to get him to stop flying operations, but Max was having none of that. This is a typical loadout for a Banff Strike Wing Mosquito. You can see that it has their preferred weapon was 8 60-pound, or should I say 3-inch rocket projectiles. It could carry a 60-pound high explosive warhead, as Typhoons did, but in this case you can see it's armed on these Mark III rails with 25-pound anti-armor heads, armor-piercing shot, in effect, that are screwed on the front of the 3-inch rocket projectile. These could quite easily just smash through the side of a destroyer or a merchant ship hull and punch a bigger hole on the way out, whilst at the same time the remnants of the fuel of the 3-inch rocket projectile would break up inside the ship and cause fires. A really deadly load, equivalent to the broadside of a 6-inch gun cruiser. The alternative to the rockets, and this is where the argument comes, this isn't an FB-26, this is something even more deadly. This is an FB-18, a real rare version of the Mosquito. Only 27 were built. You can see that it has a 57mm 6-pounder field gun in the belly of the beast, and 4 303 Brownings, mostly used those for sighting with a high proportion of tracer. You led onto the target before you pressed the trigger. When you did press the trigger for the 57mm, it fired one of these enormous shells every 1.1 second until the magazine's 25 shots was expended, and they were blindingly accurate. Squadron Leader Phillips, for example, on a strike with one of these FB-18s, which are called the Tetsi, by the way, came across a Ju-88 and let go with a burst of 4 of these shells, one of which neatly removed an engine from the Ju-88's wing. What was left of it fell into the Bay of Biscay. That's a tsetse in its natural habitat. You can see it's an extremely formidable beast. Note the fact there are only 2 303 Brownings in the nose of that particular example. That's because you could remove half the Brownings and double the ammunition loadout to give you more aiming time. It's wearing D-Day stripes, of course. That's a Mosquito in a Belgian airfield setting in the winter of 1944-45. That's a Mark 13. By this stage, Mosquitoes had discarded the Brownings for a bulbous bull nose, as it was known, which could take either American radar or British radar, centrometric, of course, operating on the 9.1 centimeter waveband. That's another Belgian shot, and this time it's a photo of Reconnaissance PR-16. This is a German airfield. You can see the British trolley accumulator here. And the Germans have tried to disguise the hangar by making it look like a rather damaged farmhouse. Didn't work, however. And you can see, obviously, the almost like an Astrodome on the top of the cockpit canopy. That's so the navigator could keep a good lookout. Or alternatively take astro shots. It's an action shot of a coastal command wing from Cornwall, which has penetrated the estuary of the river Gironde off the coast of France a few days after D-Day, and they are merrily beating up a selection of German-operated minesweepers / trawlers. As I said, extremely effective naval attack aircraft. Mosquitoes went far and wide. Here we can see a PR-16 in Alipore in India, very heavily exhaust stained, and it's operating off PS steel planking, which we thank the Americans for, because it enabled us to turn up airfields quickly. It's another shot that I really like. This is a FB6 of no less a personage than one of my favorite guys, Flight Lieutenant George Stewart, DFC, RCAF, who is alive and kicking in Hamilton to this day. And that's George's bike, by the way, was taken immediately after he landed off his 50th operational sortie and became tour expired and ended up going back to Canada along with Paul Woodrow, his navigator. George, by the way, eventually accumulated more than 1,000 hours on Mosquitoes. And that's another shot of the B-16 of the species. Well, that is possibly one of the last photographs taken of an operational World War II Mosquito. That is a PR-16 out of Cocos Islands in the Pacific. It's just made one of the last reconnaissance sorties, and it's being towed off by a jeep. All silver, as most Mosquitoes in that theatre were towards the end of the war due to an environmental problem with delamination. I mentioned that the Mosquito was a Courier aircraft. Here we see what's known as a Mark 6. That's a totally demilitarized FP6, and it's in the colors of British Overseas Airways Corporation, one of the two components, along with BEA, that became the well-known and loved British Airways of today. And it's about takeoff from Royal Air Force Lucas in Scotland on its way to Stockholm in Sweden. They carried everything from secret couriers, mail, and other things, and also on the return brought POWs, agents, and this is how your passenger traveled. In the belly of the beast, they had communication with the crew, a flask of tea or coffee, something to read, a reading light, and there they were in the Bombay. By the way, the Mosquito is linked to the successful building of the atomic bomb, because one of the people who traveled back from Stockholm, having escaped from Denmark in such a fashion, was the noted nuclear physicist Niels Bohr, who went on to become a leading light in the Manhattan Project. The Americans had mosquitoes in quantity. This is a PR-16 at the Royal Air Force Watton, and they were used for, by I think the 25th Bombardment Group, for weather reconnaissance, for post-target analysis, photography, for covert missions, many other things. And you can see, however, that this has a red tail. This was done to reduce blue on blue fratricidal shootdowns over Germany. Sadly, I have seen gun camera film from a P-51 of one of these aircraft being shot down. This is a highly modified version of a PR-16 operated by the United States Army Air Forces. As you can see, the huge bulbous nose, that is an H2X radar, mapping radar, an American development of the well-known H2S, the British invention, and that was used to provide nighttime and bad weather radar images of targets. And of course, the Americans had the NF-30. This is a shot from an airfield near Foggia in Italy, and they were used to supplement the Beaufighters that the British had supplied them before the arrival of the P-61. Very effective they were too, again, fitted with centrometric radar. This is a photograph shown of the very last bombing raid, World War II, conducted by the Royal Air Force. The main force had been stood down a few days earlier, and much to the surprise of the light night striking force, they were asked to lay on an attack on the German port of Kiel on May the 2nd, 1945. And you can see that this is a cookie. That's the phrase for a 4,000-pound bomb, high capacity. The section from here to here is filled with explosive. This is empty and is just an empty cylinder, because that gives the aerodynamic method. It's got 3 nose fuses here at this end. You can't drop this bomb safely below 4,000 feet. The blast radius is enormous. You get a crater approximately 20 feet deep and 100 yards wide. 4,000-pound bombs are not to be messed with, as the Germans found out. And this Mosquito and others like it carry one of these to Berlin and back in around about 4 hours, which meant the same Mosquito could do, not the same crew, could do 2 sorties in a dark winter night, carrying one of these to Berlin. I'd like to point out very gently that average bomb load of a B-17 to Berlin was 4,500 pounds. Well, by the way, the loss rate for the Mosquito in these sorties, 0.7%. This is a good friend of mine, sad loss. That's Captain Eric Winkle Brown, RN, the Royal Navy's most decorated pilot of World War II. Went on to be a test pilot, very famous, performed over 3,000 deck landings, flew over 450 different aircraft types. He's performing the landing of the very first Sea Mosquito prototype on a carrier deck in 1944. Sadly, the Sea Mosquito, although produced in fair quantity, didn't see action on carrier, squadron action on carrier decks, because jets were just coming in. This is another rare shot. This is a Mosquito B Mark IV modified. You see this incredible crate, which is removable underneath, carrying 2 what look like golf balls. These are highballs, naval strike weapon invented by Sir Barnes Wallis, one of my childhood heroes. And these were spun up and then dropped at around about 250, 300 miles an hour above just above the sea level, and they would bounce like a skipping stone and impact capital ships. Trials were made, by the way, and it did work. 618 Squadron was sent out to Australia to await permission to fly from Royal Navy carrier decks to attack Japanese fleet targets. This is where politics came in. Never mix warfare and politics, though politics is warfare by any other name. the United States sadly wouldn't let the RAF join in the party, so these aircraft just sat there in Australia until they were broken up. This is the last version of the Naval Mosquito. This is the TRTF-37. It's got folding wings, as you can see, the rubbering, and it's capable of carrying a torpedo. It's got an ASH radar, a Service Model H, American designed radar, 4-bladed propellers. Very capable aircraft, but as I said, just a little bit too late. And it looks vaguely like a Hornet, doesn't it? Anyway, post-World War II, relegated to secondary tasks such as target tug. And you can see here a beautifully restored example. Our chairman, John Lilly, the man who originated the idea for the People's Mosquito, actually worked on this very aircraft, and it's during its restoration, and it's now suspended from the ceiling of one of the hangars at Royal Air Force Duxford, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, and you can see it there to this day. Mosquito was well sought after by air forces around the world post World War II. Here you can see a T3, a trainer version, and it's in the colours of the Turkish Air Force. This is an extremely rare aircraft, shot that came into our possession a few years ago. Believe it or not, this is at the time of the Korean War, and this is an 81 Squadron PR-34A, the very last photo reconnaissance version of the Mozzie, and this had just flown up from its base in Hong Kong and landed at what was the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Station Iwakuni in Japan. You can see Neptune's off to this side here. I believe that's Mauler. But this aircraft had incredible performance figures for 1950-51. 43,000 foot ceiling, 435-mile-an-hour cruise, and a range of no less than 3,400 miles. So still a viable photo reconnaissance aircraft at this time. This, sadly, is the last version that was produced. One of the last versions. It's one of the ugliest. The Royal Navy decided they wanted a target towing aircraft that could also observe the fall of shot from naval guns onto towed targets at sea. And for that, they needed optically flat panels. There you can see around about 60 of them in a large nose extension. Oh dear. I mentioned George Stewart. Well, this is one of his photographs from nationalist China. The nationalist Chinese regime bought over 200 FB-26s and T-27 Mosquitoes, and unfortunately they wrote them off at around 1 a day because they just couldn't handle them properly. So George and a few other pilots and a crew of engineers were flown out to China, and they built a ground simulator by making throwing the wings off one of these crashed Mozzies outboard of the nacelles so it couldn't take off, and explaining takeoff techniques and taxiing. He's still revered, by the way, in Taiwan. This isn't a Mosquito. Well, it's bits of a Mosquito. The wing is, possibly the fin and tail. What it is some pieces of Mosquito put together by the current Chinese regime and exhibited in their museum, Aviation Museum. I think personally that this is our undercarriage. Looks like it's come from a FFTU-2, but as I said, it's very much a bit of a mismatch. The last action by a Mosquito in war was the Suez campaign. The Israeli Air Force had acquired a number of Mosquitoes of varying types, including TR-37s, PR-16s, FB-6s, and others. They were quite an effective attack force into the in the 1950s. However, they'd just been retired and withdrawn from service when the Suez campaign broke out, and they were hastily reissued to squadrons. And the Mosquitoes made such a great success of attacking the fort at Sharm el-Sheikh that the fort surrendered to a small ground column that arrived 4 days later. That was the last time they fired their guns in anger. Many of the Mosquitoes that survived in Canada came from a small airfield near, well, the city where I was born, in Derby. They were B-35s, conversions, so PR-35s, conversion of B-35s, and they were bought by Spartan Air Services, and they did a remarkable job of mapping the far north of Canada, and indeed they went as far into South Africa too, doing resource mapping. An excellent job done by Spartan. Why the People's Mosquito, and why now? This is why. This is the last European flying Mosquito. Sadly crashed in 1996 at Barton Air Show near Manchester. It was owned by British Aerospace Systems, and unfortunately the 2 crew were killed. There's an accident report available on file for you to look at online. I won't go into details, but suffice to say that one of the engines was a Merlin 25, and the other one was a related commercial version, a Merlin 500. You can read the report in full for yourselves, but it was a sad and tragic loss. And that's why John Lilly, our CEO and chairman, decided that we really ought to get one built. This isn't a Mosquito. It's a sort of a half-ish to third-ish scale replica built by a very nice French gentleman using Lycoming engines. It looked okay apparently if you were directly underneath it as it flew overhead, but any Mosquito that you need a garden ladder to get into, and you have to get in through an opening at the top, well, yes. Anyway, sadly he ground looped it and I believe broke its back, so it was up to us to do something different. As I said, we launched this. We had a treasure trove of no less than 22,300 original OEM drawings. And we'll get into that. We've been all over the UK and beyond. Speaking of a Mosquito, we've had our stand at major air shows. This is the poster that we had, a full page ad in the Royal International Air Tattoo program when there last was one. As you can see, we've gone from almost amateur beginnings to something that's very professional. I'm very proud of it. This is the crew at one of our, we have 2 event modules that we take around. We could actually man and staff and attend 2 air shows at opposite ends of the country simultaneously. There you can see some of the directors. That's John Lilly, our CEO. That's David Smith, our Director of Fundraising, or as we lovingly refer to him, Director of Begging. That's me, unfortunately. Yes, it really is, and that's Steve Manning. I must mention Steve. He's our wizard of almost everything. He keeps a close eye on our IT and also marketing and other functions. He's one of the linchpins in the organisation. So this is at the Royal International Air Tattoo. This is the only part of our Mosquito that will be in the rebuilt section. Those are the flash hider ports from underneath the belly of RL-249. And we are changing the type of Mosquito. It was originally an NF-36, the last night fighter version, and we're going to have an FB-6. That's again a smaller module at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. I said to Veronica, this is a gratuitous teddy bear shot. By the way, that's fully infant proof. It's all fabric and the nose and eyes are actually sewn, so it's totally safe for infants. We have a great online store that sells everything from DVDs to books. to branded clothing and our own designs. And some of our supporters are really enthusiastic. As you can see, this is illegal, i.e. it's transparent, and the driver can see out, and it's fitted internally on this rear window of a Renault car, and it's quite stunning. It drives around the motorways and the byways of England with that. This is our ace in the hole, and I use this term not too loosely. And my good friend, Wing Commander Bill Ramsey. Bill is our Director of Operations, and as you can see, he's driving a Royal Air Force branded Land Rover. That was his display tutor for a couple of years, but Bill was also the officer commanding the Red Arrows, and he was a Lancaster and Dakota display pilot with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. He did 2 tours on Tornadoes, several tours on Vulcans, and he was the last captain of the very last Vulcan flight. A heck of a guy. This is what he does now, actually. This is the brand new Royal Air Force 9G programmable centrifuge. And you can fight combat missions in this. And Bill is the second in command of the situation. He's training the next generation of fighter pilots. And this module can be programmed to emulate an F-35, a Tornado, an F-16, and several other fighter aircraft. And we're already taking bookings from Australia and other air forces. This is what the inside of your wing looked like. This isn't your wing, it's for Papa Zulu 474. Well, that's my friend Corin McRae. He was the CEO of Aerowood New Zealand, and he's actually building that wing in a jig. And these are what some of the mid-wing ribs look like, again, in his jigs. Beautifully done, and these are ours, by the way. We acquired the drawings for this project in a most amazing fashion. John Lilly received a phone call from a member of staff from Airbus, their Broughton factory, which is one of the sites where Mosquitoes had been built. And this gentleman said, we've got this small building that we're about to demolish tomorrow from World War II, and it's got a 5-drawer filing cabinet in it, marked Mosquito. Would you like whatever's in it? John drove across country and arrived and found, to his utter amazement, he was staring at what turned out to be 22,300 aperture cards, which had microfiche of original Mosquito drawings on them. The only thing he could do was to go and get some black garden sacks and literally empty them into those sacks, put them into his car and say thank you very much and drive away. These are laid out on Steve Manning's dining table, as you can see them. They're quite amazing. We had them digitized, as you can see, and then some reckless individual volunteered to examine them and catalog them. It took me about 4.5 months, and some of the days were more than 16 hours long, but did it. It was good fun, and that formed the basis of our drawing project. This is the inside of one fuselage leg. Instead of that, you can see the rubber discs separated by aluminum alloy spaces so they don't get welded together, and a Bakelite buffer at the end. And this is just one half of an undercarriage assembly for one side. By the way, the Mosquito undercarriage, for those of you who don't know, is not chiral. In other words, you can fit the left, there is no left and right hand in effect. In other words, if you've got an undercarriage, you can fit it either to the port or starboard. Doesn't matter, they're identical. We bought, when unfortunately Aerowood went under, we bought everything that Corin had made. All the jigs, fixtures, all his CAD drawings, everything, and put them in a container and ship them something like 15,000 miles. This is the ship they came in, the Alberta, one of the largest container ships in the world. And here she is going up Southampton Water at 11:30 at night, photographed by Alan Pickford, a wonderful finance guy, a finance director, and his good wife, who actually went down to Southampton Water to watch her come in. These are the jigs and fixtures coming off from the container, many other things. This is an Aerowood designed plywood press that can actually pre-curve sheets of plywood to any radius that you require. As you can see, they're being offloaded into one of the storage facilities of our good friends Retrotech, our suppliers. This is the Bounty when we got it out. Utterly amazing. And that's obviously a tailplane jig. Tailfin, I should say. Yeah, more. And why we chose Retrotech is very simple. Many of us know Guy Black, not for a reputation. I've worked with Guy over the years. He is one of the preeminent, award-winning aero engineers in the world when it comes to restoring aircraft. This is a deHavilland DH9, the only genuine World War I bomber flying in the world. This was found in the elephant stable of the Maharaja Bikaner in India, part of the imperial gift. Take a whole other presentation to explain to you about what happened after World War I and how we spread aircraft across the globe. But Guy brought it back to England. He's written a marvelous book about the whole saga, and he had to virtually redesign the BHP four-cylinder engine you can see there and rectify some original design faults. I've seen this aircraft fly and I was in tears. It's the most amazing thing you've ever seen. All right, so we chose Guy, and this is a short video you can see online. This is Guy on the right. This is our friend John Lilly, our CEO, and to the left is our new patron after we sadly lost Winkle Brown. This is Arthur V. Williams. He's a well-known British TV presenter. He's a former Royal Marine. Sadly suffered a very bad accident and ended in a wheelchair, but that didn't stop him learning to fly. He also produced a marvelous TV series called Flying Around Britain in his own 1943 Piper Cub, and he's actually flown in Kilo Alpha 114 at your facility, which formed part of a bigger program called The Plane That Saved Britain, which again you can see online. And he's here speaking at Retrotech's facility in the short teaser trailer for a film they're going to release. This, of course, you'll recognize is a glycol header tank for a Merlin engine. And this is how we acquired it. And this is what it looks like after Guy's finished with it. It's just a superb engineer, there's no doubt about it. Lots and lots of wood for the formers for the fuselage molds, which we decided to start first under a program we're calling Operation Jericho 2020. And there you can see the formers laid out on the floor. By the way, major points for anyone who can guess what that is. We'll get to that later. This is an outline sketch from Retrotech of the fuselage construction with a heavy steel base and the formers laid out and the bulkheads. And this is the construction of said steel base. This is the layout for what is no more, no less than a brand new Mosquito factory. Yes, this is how Guy goes about business. They've poured more than $1 million into this already. This was at the early stages when I visited. Underneath here is environmentally controlled heating, and it's absolutely superb facility now. There's some of the drawings that have been converted to actually get the lofting right for the profile of the fuselage. And this is the filling in between the formers. We're not actually using mahogany. That's now protected. All, I think about 20 plus species of mahogany are either under threat about to go extinct almost. We're using gelotong, which is another tropical hardwood, and it can withstand the necessary 3,000 pounds per square inch pressure that we need. And we've also, rather than filling the whole of that space in with gelotong, a marvelous design of using plywood boxes of various shapes and sizes to actually allow you to build just strips of gelotong laid on top of them. So 85% of the space between the formers consists of nothing but air, which makes it a lot easier to wheel these things around. There you can see mold A, which is nearly finished, and mold B, which is being worked on happily by my namesake, Ross. That's pieces of gelotong. There is a video available online, released by ourselves and Retrotech, made by Retrotech, showing the whole process of the late stages of this. I would recommend that you actually look for it. And this is the last image I've had from them, showing how progress is being made. These slots, of course, will be for the bulkheads. We have our own online magazine, which is becoming quite well thought of by historians. And the actual cost of getting this, it comes free with anyone who wants to join our People's Mosquito Club. There, it's a big plug. It only costs you $30 a year, and you get the magazine free. It's quarterly. We've also inspired some youngsters to form their own mosquito club in St Edmund's School in Norfolk, and they actually asked me questions on forms that are marked "Ask Mr. Sharp," and they're tough. They're a tough room. We hold club members' days, and this one was attended by Air Vice Marshal Lord Maxwell Beaverbrook, the grandfather of the original Lord Beaverbrook, who placed the first order for mosquitoes from deHavilland. So we are a very vigorous club, and this is our youngest member. He's 8. I believe we've got 1 or 2 younger ones now, but he certainly was the youngest at the time. And this is what you get. Another appeal, please join, and you get a rather nice gift pin. That's for a life member. Life member costs about $325, I think. And we're also actively seeking corporate sponsorship, US companies in any field. We're going to need electrics and electronics. We're going to need instrumentation and lots of other modern things. And you can contact us, our CEO. You can write to him directly. John doesn't mind getting email info@peoplesmosquito.org.uk. If you want to write to me, just put ross@peoplesmosquito.org. Now, by the way, if you get utterly bored and want to look at 23,000 aircraft photographs, you can always look on my Twitter feed. And you can also, well, you won't need my skill when it comes to this consultancy, but I'm sure anyone who wants to contact me, they're allowed to. And this is my contact details, my number, and there's the email. Please feel free to contact me with further questions. And that's the end of the slideshow, and it's
Ross,
coming up on the hour.
if you just want to hold it on that, if you'll go back 1 slide, that's perfect. If we'll keep that up there during the Q&A in case we miss anybody's question, they can always reach out to you directly. Ross, thank you so much for a great presentation this evening. We have got a ton of questions backlogged here, so hopefully you've got a little while to spend with us remaining this evening. First things first, Willard Strandberg actually did guess what the airplane was that you were sitting in at the beginning, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about that particular airplane, as it's something of an unusual type that's not widely recognized by a broader audience.
Okay, well, I was hoping someone was going to confuse it with the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation Wingeel, which looks incredibly like that aircraft. It's a Handley Page Provost T1. That was the Royal Air Force's basic fighter trainer in the 1950s for a good while. That's when the Royal Air Force, against the run of fashion in trainers, decided to go for side-by-side training. That has positives and negatives, of course. You can see what the students are doing with their hands and feet, but you've got a lot of drag. You're actually broadening the whole fuselage to do this. The piston provost led on to the jet provost, which many of you will know. Now, the piston provost was used quite successfully by the Irish Air Corps, the Union of Burma Air Force, and amazingly by the Sultan of Oman's Air Force, where it saw a lot of action in that Middle East country, putting down tribal rebellions and other things. It was quite a capable counterinsurgency aircraft. You could arm it with underwing rockets, iron bombs, and fixed machine guns. As a matter of fact, there is a Sultan of Oman Air Force marked provost in the collection of the Royal Air Force. Well done, by the way, for the guy who guessed that. Well done. Powered by 575 horsepower Leonardo's nice round engine.
Your second question about guessing what type of airplane was next to your Mosquito molds, if it was a Storch, the same gentleman guessed that correct as well.
He's on a roll. That's marvelous. It's actually one of the Argus engine Storches, when the French were still building them with Argus engines, as well as I've got Luftwaffe ones left behind in France. And there's one about 20 miles away from where I am with the Collins collection. I see that flying occasionally. But yes, it's a genuine Storch, and it has the gunner's ring in the rear cockpit, which is very rare indeed.
Thank you for that. We've got a bunch of questions that have been asked about the Mosquito prototype. I know it's doubtless a very long story, but could you perhaps summarize how it is that particular airplane came to survive for as long as it did?
Okay. Well, basically, the Royal Air Force, well, through the Air Ministry, issued a specification for a new bomber in about 1936. It was B13/38. And what this called for was a multi-engined aircraft capable of carrying 3,000 pounds for 1,500 miles, 275 miles per hour, and expecting it to be armed with the usual gun turrets, etc., multi-place crew, i.e. at least 3. So Geoffrey deHavilland and his design team looked at this and thought, well, we could modify a deHavilland DH-91 Albatross, which is built on a similar construction method to what became the Mosquito, and had 4 575 horsepower Gypsy King engines, air-cooled. If we put a couple of Merlins in that and hung a gun turret maybe on it, this might satisfy the requirement of the specification. And they looked at this and thought, oh, not really. Then they looked at the deHavilland Flamingo, their new 18-seat all-metal airliner that was just coming into service, and thought, can we militarize that as a bomber? And then again, they rejected that compromise. And the design team sat down and said, well, if we remove all the extra weight that goes with gun turrets, extra crew, larger wing area to lift the extra weight, make it as smaller aircraft as possible, and put 2 Merlins on it, then it will actually end up being faster than a Spitfire. And the powers that be thought this was insane, and there were sort of very contentious arguments inside the Air Ministry, and eventually Sir Wilfred Freeman, and that's why it's called Freeman's Folly, by the way, stepped in and ordered a single example, which later expanded to a 50 aircraft contract. The RAF still wasn't sold on the idea and insisted on having a couple of aircraft modified with a 4-gun rear turret, which of course had more than a ton of weight, put the drag up considerably, slowed the aircraft down by around about 30 miles an hour, and deHavilland conclusively proved that this wouldn't work. By the way, the turret was designed by Bristol's, and we've got the drawings for it. So at the end of the day, W4050 was used as a company test vehicle for all the families of mosquitoes. The slide I showed with the red oxide cowlings is a mid-war configuration with the two-stage Merlin engines, the 60 series Merlin engines it was, and that went on to be the very fastest Mosquito of all in that configuration, because it was the lightest one with the highest powered engine with 70 series Merlins. It managed, we believe, something like 453 miles per hour. But that aircraft, again, was used to show dignitaries. It was demonstrated in front of General Hap Arnold and then Major Quesada at the time, and other high-ranking officials at Hatfield. And General Arnold went away with a whole bunch of data and some outline drawings and brought them back to the States and asked around, anyone like to build this? And the only people that were around that had spare capacity was a consortium of aircraft manufacturers headed up by Bell. And they looked at this and they said, no, it's a retrograde step. It's an old material. We don't believe it's going to last as a warplane, and we're not interested. Later, the United States Air Force would try and swap P-51s for Mustangs on a one-to-one basis. That didn't work. So the aircraft survived as a test vehicle. At the end of the war, Sir Geoffrey had this scheme to put this aircraft, possibly a Moth, and another de Havilland type in the front of the factory headquarters building at Hatfield as a small museum. That scheme fell through. It was then put into stored in a disassembled state and shuffled around when people recognized that this, certainly the Mozzie enthusiasts inside the company recognized that it had value as an artifact. It was eventually discovered, and there was a meeting chaired by Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, and they decided that they were going to reconstruct the aircraft. And not only that, they put out an appeal, and they got enough money to put a small hangar up on the original site at Salisbury Hall. And that was where it resided. And it formed the core then of the de Havilland Aircraft Museum that we have today. And more power to their elbow. They do a marvelous job. They have 3 Mosquitoes there. And I go there regularly when I'm in the UK.
Thank you for that answer, Russ. We've had a couple folks ask about the exhaust configurations on the Mosquito, and that using a Merlin, it's perhaps more traditional to expect 6 pipes on either side of the nacelle, but that is almost never the case with a Mosquito. Can you talk a little bit about how the exhausts were configured and why they were constructed that way?
Yeah, well, it's quite simple. We went from one exhaust, the collector exhaust I showed you. Our friend Tony Agar has built a static version from bits of aircraft that recovered from the film 633 Squadron, amongst other things, into an NF2 static. It is now taxiable. And that has what's known as a saxophone exhaust, which is a 2-port exhaust collected into that. And that was relatively satisfactory. Why you have a Siamese port for exhaust ports 5 and 6 is very simple. It's a very short distance between those last exhaust port 6 as it was, and the front of the tray, which contains the heat exchanger for the cabin, the oil cooler, and the radiator for the engine. In other words, it's sufficient heat being blasted out to actually affect the cooling of the engine itself, right? So by Siamesing the ports and moving it forward about 4 or 5 inches, there's sufficient dilution by the airstream and the propeller blast to make the heating effect minimal. Why you see 6 ports on many Mosquitoes is very simple. The 2-stage Merlin engine is approximately 7 inches longer than the single-stage Merlin engine. That means the engine bearers are that much longer, which means that you can put 6 individual extractor exhausts on and not have to worry your head about heating the engine up itself through the air coolers.
This is kind of all a reflection of the particular type of Merlin fitted to a given airplane. You mentioned 633 Squadron. We've had some folks ask what became of the airplanes that participated in the filming of that movie. It sounds like perhaps parts was all that was left.
No, believe it or not, the T3 that flew as part of most of these aircraft were the ones that were flying with number 3 Civilian Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Unit out of Exeter Airport. And that's a bunch of ex-military and civilian pilots and navigators who provided target time facilities for Air Force, the Navy and the Army guns up and down the UK, on the West Coast particularly. These towed streamed targets. You could carry 4 of them. You could stream them serially. An amazing job was done until when the Mosquito was finally withdrawn from that unit. Nurse Corporation went in and bought Mosquitoes, one of which was actually formed part of the crash scene in 633. One of them was burnt, and Tony Agar got the remnants of that. RR299 was part of the number 3 CAACU stable, and that went to British Aerospace, and that was one that eventually crashed. TA719 went to the Imperial War Museum and was restored. That's the one that our chairman worked on, and various others of them were disposed of. I believe one of them, registered G. Mosley, went eventually to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it was converted to externally resemble a PR-16, which you can do very easily, which was used by those units I showed you in the slideshow.
Ross, that brings us to a follow-up question about the PR-16. Did the U.S. Army Air Forces have its own internal designation for the PR-16, or did they just port across the British nomenclature to the American aircraft?
They ported across that nomenclature. However, this doesn't mean that there was never an American designation for the Mosquito. Prior to their adoption of the PR-16 as their standard, they had taken, they literally pleaded for Mosquito production from the Canadian line, and they were given 40 bomber versions, which they were then converted into photo reconnaissance machines called the F8. And I'm in possession of photographs of F8s from NACA. The F8 wasn't really fitted for use, and it didn't have high altitude capabilities. It wasn't quite long-legged enough for ETO operations. So the PR-16 was adopted instead, and they kept the British designation of that, despite the fact they had some of them that was so far away from photo reconnaissance you wouldn't believe. You actually had CIA operations called Joan Allena, which had an operative with a Mosquito, an operative in the bomb bay with a wire recorder, getting direct voice transmissions from an agent in the ground in either Holland or Germany, with the Mosquito orbiting at 30,000 feet, and the agent on the ground using a VHF radio that weighed about 4.5 pounds and easily concealable. And it was uninterceptable because it was literally going up in a cone from the ground up to the orbit of the Mosquito. So it was safe from the Sicherheitsdienst vans that used to patrol around, and it was quite an amazing operation. So again, that's down to American ingenuity towards the end of the war.
I think I remember reading that it was famously cold inside the fuselage of that airplane for whoever was doing the necessary recording. You mentioned earlier in the presentation that the airplanes were used as bombers. What did they use in the way of a bomb sight or bomb aiming device?
I believe they had the usual Mark 16 Royal Air Force sight at this stage. You can get into the nose of the bomber version by squirreling yourself past various controls, the navigator that is, and make quite an effective use of a bomb sight. And that was used at high altitude, particularly by the Royal Air Force when they were dropping marker flares. I have to confess, and this is a terrible confession on the Royal Air Force's part, when the RAF started World War II, we didn't really have a usable marker flare. By the end of World War II, you will have seen that large casing I showed you of the 4,000-pound high-capacity bomb. Well, if you filled 2,000 pounds, two-thirds of that, with over 2,300 pounds of flare material, you got something called the pink pansy, which gave a huge flower-like explosion on the ground, and it was impossible to duplicate by the Germans. So yes, we had a whole range of dropping devices, and also we developed the oboe system using two radar stations, one called CAT, the other Mouse, one in Norfolk, one in Kent, whereby you could control a Mosquito flying at 25 to 30,000 feet to within around about 10 feet on an arced pathway. And then at that point, you were getting around about a 100-yard error on the ground aiming point, literally, and it wiped out Krupps and other difficult targets in the Ruhr.
Certainly, the impact the Mosquitoes had in those pathfinding operations was felt across Bomber Command. You mentioned that wood is used extensively in the construction, and hence the often applied nickname Wooden Wonder. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the exact types of wood used, and if possible, where was metal actually used in the construction of the airframe?
Okay, well, I'll run through the metal first since it's easier, and you've got approximately 1,600 pounds of various metals under each Merlin. Then there are light alloy sheaths around the compressed rubber undercarriage units. One of the critical ways of saving metal was that de Havilland used magnesium alloy rather than aluminum alloy wherever they could. Magnesium is much lighter than aluminium, and but it does have a nasty tendency to catch fire under friction, and also its mode of corrosion is such that the individual metallic components in their crystals corrode along the intercrystalline cracks, interstitial cracks, and they fall out like teeth from from a rotten jaw. So you have to be very careful with magnesium. But no, that's one of the ways. So metal was used on obviously the undercarriage components, on the framing of the rudder. The ailerons were metal. The flaps were wood, by the way. The composites of wood are as follows. You obviously had a whole forest of Ecuadorian balsa was sacrificed. You had birch ply, a lot of it from Wisconsin, by the way. You had spruce ply in the nose section. You had spruce, laminated spruce for the wing spars, spruce stringers between the two ply skins on the upper surface. You had the bulkheads with spruce. You also had ash because of its hard wearing properties. You had, believe it or not, Western red cedar is shown on one of the drawings for strengthening the underfloor area. And it's a note: if you can't get Western red cedar, you're allowed to use spruce. Birch, of course, as I mentioned. Walnut, believe it or not, for the pickup structures on the wing, because walnut is immensely strong. It's strong. It's at least as strong as steel. Doesn't work out so well in torsion, but it is quite amazing. I should mention one wood that you will see in some references with regard to Australian mosquitoes. de Havilland Australia had difficulty getting hold of birch. So they decided to substitute coach wood, and that's the name of it, which is a local Australian wood that resembles birch in many ways. They constructed it and then found to their horror that to actually get the strength, the surrounds, their framing they were constructing to actually put the fuel tanks under wing wouldn't fit because the dimensions to give the strength they needed were greater than those in birch. So they had to get birch in the end. Yeah, so it's a composite mainly of 6 different types of wood.
Thank you for answering that. We've got just time for a couple more questions.
Okay, go ahead.
So we've had a question here. Out of all the flying insects, why the mosquito name? It perhaps broke a little bit with the convention of some of the earlier de Havilland names.
Well, as you know, Sir Geoffrey was an avid lepidopterist. His moth collection was legendary. Hence the many moth names, you know, fox moth, puss moth, hornet moth, so on and so forth. But I think the mosquito was chosen because he wanted something that was would irritate the enemy and would bite them unexpectedly. And of course, that's the unofficial name for the FB-18 was the tsetse, which carries the sickness, the sleeping sickness bacterium. So that would obviously put you to sleep. That was the whole idea.
Okay, and the last question we've got for you this evening, and I know there are dozens more being asked, but
by all means, tell them to write in. Yeah, I'm willing to answer.
Absolutely. Ross's email contact information is available there on the screen. If you'd like to reach him directly with your question, if we missed it this evening, please feel free to do that. Ross, with I guess the 100th anniversary of the de Havilland Company coming up in September of this year, do you have any special plans to mark the occasion?
Sadly, of course, Romeo Lima 249 won't be in the air to meet that, unless we get a sudden amazing surge in fundraising. I should like to point out that we've raised approximately $140,000 in 14 weeks, which has enabled, I'll give you a bit of a heads up here. We've just ordered our first lot of spruce. We've ordered, of course, lots of gelatong, lots of plywood, but now we're into spruce. So yes, the donations we're getting and the club membership, we're running a great program. I urge you all to look at Operation Jericho, whereby, if you want to, the higher levels of that actually allow you to reserve a slot to fly in it. So I just lay that small egg out there.
Oh, I think that you'll have a number of folks who've been listening this evening very, very interested in that opportunity. So, Ross, thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for telling us about the People's Mosquito, but also thank you for exploring this incredible aircraft and history with us. So, folks, if you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider making a donation to the People's Mosquito or to the Military Aviation Museum here. Again, your contributions do help keep these webinar programs free and available to everybody. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And Ross, thank you so much again for your time.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure interacting with your membership and the others who joined in on the webinar. And I'm always available for other subjects should you need.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing the People's Mosquito fly, and perhaps in the distant future, there'll be an opportunity for us all to fly together.
I look forward to that. Once again, thank you.